The first time Sheriff Dale Packard saw the racks, he thought someone had died. 14 wooden frames lined the south-facing slope behind Nora Baines's cabin like grave markers, each one draped with something he couldn't quite make out from the road. Strips of dark red, pale rings of something, flat green sheets that curled at the edges like old paper. He reined his horse closer and realized it was food. Meat and apples and squash and herbs and beans, all of it laid out in the open air under cheesecloth screens, drying in the July sun like laundry no one had bothered to collect. He'd seen jerky made before. Every rancher and hunter in the Bitterroot Valley knew how to salt and dry a few strips of venison to get through a trail ride. But this looked like a woman trying to dry the entire harvest. Stay with me, because what happened next changed the way 43 families in the valley survived the worst winter in Montana Territory's recorded history. But to understand the racks, you have to understand the woman who built them. Nora Baines arrived in the Bitterroot Valley in the spring of 1881 with a dead husband's name, a bay mare named Juniper, and a half-starved gray dog that had followed her wagon out of Missoula and refused to leave. She was 26 years old, thin from a winter of grief and bad provisions, with calloused hands that looked 10 years older than her face. Thomas Baines had died of pneumonia the previous November, 3 weeks after they'd filed their homestead claim. He'd gone out to check the fence line in a freezing rain and come back shivering. 4 days later, Nora was a widow with 160 acres of frozen grass and a cabin with gaps in the chinking wide enough to see stars through. Most people expected her to sell the claim and go back east. A woman alone on a Montana homestead was not unheard of, but it was unusual enough to draw comment at Harlan's General Store, where opinion on the matter was divided between those who gave her until June and those who gave her until the first snow. Nora did not go back east. She'd come from a family of Pennsylvania Dutch farmers in Lancaster County, people who had survived lean years the way their grandparents had survived lean years in the Palatinate. Not by luck, but by method. Her grandmother, Brigitte Schaefer, had kept a root cellar so well stocked that neighbors called it the second pantry, and she'd taught Nora something that most frontier settlers had either forgotten or never learned: that the difference between starving and surviving was not how much you grew, but how much you kept. Any fool can grow a tomato, Brigitte used to say in her clipped German accent, sitting on the porch in Letitz with a basket of apple slices spread on a screen frame. The clever ones eat tomatoes in February. The gray dog, Nora called him Flint on account of his color and because he seemed to spark to life only when she was near. Had amber eyes that caught the light like creek water over stones. He was shaggy and quiet, more wolf than dog in his barren, and he took to following Nora with the kind of devotion that suggested he decided his fortunes were tied to hers, and that was the end of it. He slept at the foot of her bed, sat beside her while she worked the garden, and watched the road with the steady patience of a creature that expected nothing from the world but had decided to stay anyway. Nora spent that first full spring doing what every other homesteader in the valley was doing: plowing, planting, mending fences, patching the cabin. But she also did something no one else was doing. She built drying racks. The frames were simple: pine boards 4 feet by 6 feet, with legs that held them at waist height and a slight angle toward the sun. She stretched cheesecloth across the tops to keep the flies off, and built small wooden trays that slid in and out like drawers. She built 14 of them, which took her the better part of 3 weeks, and when she was done, she lined them up on the south-facing slope behind her cabin, where the wind came steady and the afternoon sun hit hardest. Then she started drying everything. Not just meat, the way the hunters did. Everything. She sliced apples paper thin and laid them on the trays until they turned to sweet, leathery rings. She cut squash into strips and beans into halves and spread them until they went hard and light as kindling. She picked wild herbs, sage, thyme, yarrow, and hung them in bundles from the cabin rafters until the whole place smelled like a medicine chest. She cut venison and elk into strips no thicker than a finger, salted them, peppered them, and set them on the racks for days until they were dark and stiff and would keep for months without turning. She dried berries, plums, onions, even eggs, cracking them into a thin layer on greased trays and drying them to a brittle sheet that could be crumbled and reconstituted with water. She did this all summer, every day. While her neighbors were focused on putting up hay and fattening cattle, Nora Baines was slicing and salting and turning and checking, moving trays in and out of the sun like a woman tending a garden made of patience. That was when Sheriff Packard rode up and stopped. "Mrs. Baines," he said, tipping his hat. He was the broad man with a thick mustache and the kind of easy authority that came from being the only law in a valley of 800 people. Not a cruel man, but a certain one. "You expecting a siege?" Nora was turning apple slices on a rack. She didn't look up. "No, sir. Got enough dried food here to supply a cavalry unit. You planning to open a store?" "No." Packard leaned on his saddle horn and looked at the rows of racks, the strips of meat going dark in the wind, the pale circles of apple and the split beans curling on their trays. Flint sat beside Nora's boot and watched the sheriff with those amber eyes, perfectly still. "Mrs. Baines, I don't mean any disrespect, but you've got a hay barn that still needs a south wall and a root cellar that floods every time it rains. Might be your time is better spent on things that'll actually get you through the winter, instead of," he waved a hand at the racks, "whatever this is." "This is what gets me through the winter," Nora said. Packard looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head with the particular expression men reserved for women they considered touched but harmless. "Suit yourself," he said, and rode on. Word spread, the way word always did in a valley where entertainment was scarce, and other people's business was the closest thing to a newspaper. By August, Nora's drying operation had become a topic of mild amusement at Harlan's store, at the church after Sunday service, and at the stockman's bar where the ranchers gathered on Saturday evenings to argue about cattle prices and complain about the weather. "She's drying eggs," Pete Caldwell told the bar one Saturday, in the tone of a man delivering the punchline to a joke. "Cracking eggs onto a board and letting them bake in the sun. I saw it myself." "Dried eggs," repeated Jonas Wheeler, a rancher with a spread twice the size of Nora's and an opinion on everything. "What's next, dried water?" "Woman's gone simple," said Frank Meeker, who ran the feedlot. "Grief does that sometimes. Lost her husband and now she's out there playing house with food nobody's going to eat. Even the women in the valley, who were generally more charitable, expressed concern in the careful way frontier women had of being kind while still being clear. Martha Caldwell brought Nora a pie and gently suggested that if she needed help putting up proper preserves, canning, smoking, salting the regular way, the church ladies would be happy to assist. Nora thanked her for the pie and kept drying. The hay barn did eventually get its south wall, and the root cellar got a drainage trench that mostly kept it dry. But the rack stayed up from May through October, and Nora spent every spare hour she had processing food. She built a small smokehouse, too, no bigger than an outhouse, and used it to finish some of the meats after their time on the racks. She packed dried goods into cotton sacks and stacked them on shelves she'd built along the cabin's back wall. She filled tin containers with dried herbs and vegetables and lined them up like books. She rendered fat and packed pemmican into tight balls with dried berries and stored them in crocks sealed with tallow. By the time the first frost came in late September, Nora Baines had more preserved food in her cabin than Harlan's general store had on its shelves. Flint would sit in the doorway and watch her count inventory. 28 sacks of dried meat, 14 containers of dried vegetables, 9 jars of dried fruit, 4 crocks of pemmican, bundles of herbs hanging from every rafter. And if a dog could look satisfied, he did. Her neighbors thought she was eccentric. A harmless oddity, the widow who spent her summers making food no one wanted to eat when there was perfectly good canning to be done. Perfectly good smokehouses that worked the way smokehouses had always worked. "I told her," Sheriff Packard mentioned to his deputy one afternoon in October, watching the first thin clouds stack up against the bitter roots. Told her she was wasting time on those fool racks when she had real work to do. Some people just won't listen. The winter of 1881 to 82 announced itself early and without apology. The first snow came on October 19th, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that it didn't stop. By November, 3 feet of snow lay in the valley, and the temperature had dropped to 10 below zero. By December, the drifts were over fence posts, and the mercury had fallen to 25 below. The old-timers at Harlan's store, who kept informal records of such things, said they'd never seen it this cold this early. Then January came, and January was something else entirely. The temperature dropped to 32 below zero on January 8th and stayed below -20 for 3 straight weeks. The wind came down from the north like something with teeth, driving snow sideways and piling drifts against cabin walls until some homesteaders had to dig tunnels to reach their outbuildings. Cattle froze standing up in the fields. Horses huddled in barns and burned through hay at twice the normal rate. The road to Missoula became impassable by mid-January, which meant no supply wagons, no mail, no help, and the food began to run out, not all at once, not dramatically. It happened the way hunger always happens on the frontier, slowly, then suddenly. The canned goods went first, because people ate them freely in November and December, not realizing the winter would outlast their planning. The smoked meat held longer, but was finite. The root cellars, which should have been stocked with potatoes and turnips and squash, had been hit by the early frost and held less than expected. By the second week of January, families in the valley were rationing. By the third week, some were going hungry. Martha Caldwell's children were eating flour paste and boiled oats twice a day. The Wheeler family had slaughtered their last hog 2 weeks earlier than planned and were stretching the meat thin. Frank Meeker's wife sent word through a neighbor that they were down to cornmeal and salt pork and not much of either. Even Sheriff Packard, who kept a better stocked larder than most, was cutting portions and wondering how long the road to Missoula would stay closed. And then Pete Caldwell rode through waist-deep snow to Nora Baines's cabin on a Tuesday afternoon in late January, hat in his hands, shame on his face, to ask if the widow with the drying racks had any food to spare. Nora opened the door and the heat hit Pete Caldwell like a wall. Her cabin was small but warm, the stove burning steady, and the smell inside was extraordinary. A rich, savory steam that he later described as the best thing he'd ever smelled in his life. She had a pot on the stove, and in it was a stew made from ingredients Pete couldn't identify. Dark strips of something that was clearly meat, but looked like nothing he'd pulled from a smokehouse. Chunks of vegetable that had been hard as stone an hour ago and were now soft and fragrant. Dried herbs that had reconstituted into something that smelled like a summer garden. Flint watched Pete from the corner, amber eyes steady. "Come in," Nora said. "Close the door." Pete stepped inside and looked at the back wall of the cabin. The shelves were still lined with sacks and tins and crocks. Not as full as they'd been in October, but fuller than anything he'd seen in the valley in weeks. The dried food, that foolish, eccentric, waste of time dried food, was still there, holding, waiting, as light and compact and enduring as the day she'd packed it. "Mrs. Baines," Pete said, and his voice cracked in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "My children are hungry." Nora looked at him. She didn't say "I told you so." She didn't remind him about the joke he'd told at the stockman's bar about dried eggs. She turned to the shelf, pulled down 2 sacks of dried meat, a tin of dried vegetables, a crock of pemmican, and a bundle of herbs, and set them on the table. "The meat reconstitutes in hot water in about 20 minutes, she said. "The vegetables take a little longer. The pemmican you can eat straight. The children will like it. It's got berries in it. The herbs go in the broth." Pete stared at the food on the table. Then he looked at Nora. "I laughed at you," he said. "I know." "I'm sorry," Nora nodded. "Take the food home, Mr. Caldwell. Feed your family. When the snow melts, I'll show your wife how to build the racks." Pete Caldwell was not the last person to come to Nora's door that winter. Jonas Wheeler came the next day, with his hat in his hands and the same look on his face. Then Frank Meeker's wife, Ruth, who cried when she saw the shelves and couldn't speak for a full minute. Then the Dawson family from the north end of the valley. Then the Haskells. Then old Virgil Price, who lived alone and had been eating boiled leather from a belt strap for 2 days before his neighbor checked on him. Sheriff Packard came last. He rode up on a Thursday morning in early February, when the cold had finally broken just enough to make travel possible. He sat on his horse in front of Nora's cabin for a long time before he dismounted. Flint was sitting on the porch, watching him with that patient, amber gaze. Packard took off his hat when Nora opened the door. "Mrs. Baines," he said, "I've come to ask for your help. There are families on the east side of the valley I can't reach. The Turners, the Mitchells, the Garrity place. They've been snowed in since Christmas, and I don't know what shape they're in. Nora looked at him. You want dried food. I want whatever you can spare. And I want... He stopped, swallowed. The words seemed to cost him something. I want to apologize. I stood right here last July and told you that you were wasting your time. I was wrong. I was flat wrong. And I knew it the moment Pete Caldwell came back from your place with enough food to feed his family for 2 weeks from 4 sacks and a crock. 5 sacks, Nora said quietly. 5 sacks. Packard looked at the ground. I've been sheriff of this valley for 11 years. It's my job to keep people safe. And the person who actually kept them safe this winter was the woman I told to fix her hay barn. Nora went inside and came back with a canvas bag packed with dried provisions, meat, vegetables, pemmican, herbs, dried egg powder. Enough to keep 3 families going for a week or more, and it weighed less than 20 pounds. The dried eggs, she said, handing him the bag. You mix them with water, 1 tablespoon of powder to 2 tablespoons of water. They cook up almost like fresh. Packard took the bag. He looked like a man who wanted to say more, but knew that more words wouldn't improve on the ones he'd already said. Thank you, Mrs. Baines. You're welcome, Sheriff. He mounted up and turned his horse toward the east road. Then he stopped. Would you teach people, he asked, how to do what you do, the racks, the drying, all of it? Nora stood in her doorway with Flint at her side, the cold pressing in around her like a living thing, and she thought about her grandmother Brigitte on the porch in Lititz, spreading apple slices on a screen frame and saying things that sounded simple but weren't. Knowledge isn't like gold, Sheriff, Nora said. Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger. Is that a yes? That's a yes. The winter of 1881 to 82 killed over 100 head of cattle in the Bitterroot Valley, collapsed 4 barns, and left 11 families dependent on charity or luck for survival. But no one starved, not one person. And the reason, though it was slow to be admitted openly, was that a widow with 14 drying racks and a gray dog had done what no one else thought to do. She had made summer last. When the snow melted in March, Nora started teaching. She began with Martha Caldwell and Ruth Meeker, showing them how to build the racks, how to slice food to the right thickness, how to judge when something was dry enough to store. She showed them the difference between sun drying and wind drying, which foods needed salt and which didn't, how to tell when meat had dried safely and when it had spoiled. She taught them about pemmican, the rendered fat, the dried berries, the way it packed dense with energy and kept for months in a sealed crock. By May, 6 women in the valley had their own racks. By July, 14. The men helped build them, which was its own kind of apology. Jonas Wheeler, who had joked about dried water, spent a Saturday building racks for his wife with lumber he'd milled himself, and he did it without being asked. Sheriff Packard did something more. He wrote to the territorial office in Helena and described what Nora had done, how her dried provisions had fed a valley through the worst winter in memory. He asked if there was interest in sending someone to learn her methods. The letter made its way to a clerk who passed it to a territorial agricultural agent who rode down to the Bitterroot Valley in August of 1882 and spent 3 days at Nora's cabin taking notes. You learned this from your grandmother? The agent asked, watching Nora turn strips of elk on a rack while Flint dozed in the shade. My grandmother learned it from hers, Nora said. People have been drying food since before there were houses to keep it in. We just forgot, is all. Got so excited about canning and smoking that we forgot the simplest way is sometimes the best. The agent published a pamphlet that fall. Practical Methods of Food Preservation for the Western Homestead, it was called, with a line on the cover crediting the techniques of Mrs. Nora Baines of the Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. It was distributed to homesteaders across 3 territories. 22 years later, in the summer of 1903, a young woman named Caroline Haskell rode up to Nora Baines's cabin on a dun mare and asked if she could learn. Caroline was the daughter of the same Haskell family that had come to Nora's door during the Great Winter. She was 18, newly married, about to move with her husband to a homestead in the Flathead Valley, and she was terrified of her first winter. Nora was 48 now. Her hair had gone gray at the temples, and her hands, always calloused, had the thick, rope-like quality of hands that had never stopped working. Juniper the mare had died years ago. Her granddaughter, a bay with the same steady temperament, stood in the paddock. Flint had died too, in the winter of 1893, curling up at the foot of Nora's bed one night and simply not waking up. But his granddaughter, a shaggy gray creature with the same amber eyes and the same watchful silence, lay on the porch and regarded Caroline with calm interest. The racks were still there, more of them now, 22 in a long row on the south slope, weathered silver by 2 decades of sun and wind. And they were not alone. All across the Bitterroot Valley and in the neighboring valleys, and in homesteads as far away as the Yellowstone country, families had racks of their own. The pamphlet had spread the knowledge. The winters had proven its worth. What had once been a widow's eccentricity was now common practice, and there were people raising children who had never known a winter without dried provisions on the shelf. "I'll teach you," Nora told Caroline, "but you have to promise me something." "What's that?" "When you know how, you teach someone else. That's the whole point. The knowing has to keep moving," Caroline promised. She stayed for 2 weeks and learned everything: the racks, the slicing, the salting, the timing, the pemmican, the dried eggs, the herbs. She filled a notebook with measurements and methods and sketches of rack designs. When she left, Nora gave her a bundle of dried sage and a small crock of pemmican for the road. "Mrs. Baines," Caroline said, mounted on her mare and ready to go. "My mother told me that when you fed us that winter, you never once said anything about how people had laughed at you. She said you just handed over the food and told her how to cook it." Nora shrugged. "What would be the point of saying anything? People were hungry. That's all that mattered." "But weren't you angry? Even a little?" Nora thought about it. She thought about Pete Caldwell's cracked voice and Sheriff Packard's hat in his hands, and Jonas Wheeler building racks in his yard without being asked. She thought about her grandmother Brigitte, who had fed neighbors through lean years in Pennsylvania without keeping score, because keeping score was not the same as keeping people alive. "No," she said, "I wasn't angry. The point was never to prove anyone wrong. The point was to not go hungry. And once I had enough, the point was to make sure nobody else went hungry either. That's not anger. That's just sense." Caroline rode north with her notebook and her pemmican and her bundle of sage, and Nora watched her go from the porch with the gray dog beside her and the summer sun warm on the racks. That evening, Nora walked the south slope the way she did every evening, checking the racks the way a farmer checks fences, not because she expected anything wrong, but because the checking was part of the work, and the work was part of who she was. The dog walked with her, quiet and patient, amber eyes catching the last of the light. The valley spread out below, golden in the late sun, and from where Nora stood, she could see, on distant hillsides and in far-off yards, the shapes of other racks. Dozens of them, scores, small wooden frames angled toward the sun, doing quietly what they had always done, turning summer into something that could survive the winter. Nora touched the nearest rack, felt the warm wood under her hand, smooth from years of use. She didn't need to dry food anymore, not really. Her shelves were full, and her reputation was such that half the valley would have fed her through any winter without question. But she still did it, every summer, every year, because the work was the thing, and the knowing was the thing, and passing it on was the thing. And all of it together was a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with purpose. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, the dog at her heels, the racks standing behind her in their long silver row, patient as prayer, holding the last light of the day.